And welcome back to Real Talk Sports with Rico. Today, I'm actually doing a quick recap of my thoughts and reaction to the Super Bowl. Want to thank everybody out there that is subscribed and chimed into the show. And also want to thank the sponsors that have put sponsorship on the show. Want to thank Spotify and Anchor, which is now Spotify Podcast and YouTube, for going ahead and housing the podcast. So let me go ahead and jump into the 4 points that I talked about on the show prior to the Super Bowl, starting with Christian McCaffrey versus the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Remember, I told you guys that every time CMC went for 70 plus, the San Francisco's 49ers did win. They had a 12-1 record, including into the playoffs. However, the Kansas City Chiefs, and that caveat is this: every time that they held a running back to under 110 yards, they actually were 7-0. And guess what happened? Christian McCaffrey had 80 yards on the ground and he was held under 110. Kansas City won this matchup. And this was the first key point that I had talked about here into the Super Bowl. Next up, guys, the next point into this, I had Brock Purdy versus the Kansas City Chiefs. So essentially what I was saying about this is that Brock Purdy was going to have to win the game with his arm at some point. I knew that San Francisco would be able to pretty much go out there and run the football. I knew that they were going to be able to pretty much go out there and window dress as well, with a whole bunch of motion and things like that, and kind of scheme some guys open. You saw that happen with Deebo Samuels. You saw them get Elijah Mitchell involved. You saw them get Brandon Ayuk involved. And so they had Juan Jennings involved as well. And there was a lot of motions and things like that that really helped them. But the key to this is that you needed Brock Purdy to come up with more than just a touchdown. And I think ultimately speaking, if you look at the last drive where Kansas City held, that's a play where I think Brock Purdy has got to find a way to get that into the end zone. And that's just going to be a play that he has to make. Take nothing away from Brock Purdy. He was 23 of 38 for 255 and a touchdown, but he needed one more touchdown, I think, to go ahead and knock the Chiefs off. And with that being said, I think that the Chiefs essentially won that battle as well. Next up, the third point that we had into this is we actually had Patrick Mahomes and we had Travis Kelce going against the 49ers defense. And so I think that both Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce won their matchup as well. First, starting with Patrick Mahomes, 34 of 46, 333 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he did have an INT that ended a streak where I believe he had 292 consecutive passes before he had an INT. Remember, I talked about Mahomes having a 100-plus rate. He had a 99.3 because of the actual interception. And that goes right on line with what he pretty much did for the season. Had 27 touchdowns, 4 INTs, 92 rate, but he was slightly above that. So I think he won that. But the biggest thing that Patrick Mahomes did that the San Francisco 49ers did not stop is he actually led Kansas City in rushing. He had 9 attempts for 66 yards. Remember, I told you guys that Patrick Mahomes was number one amongst quarterbacks who scrambled outside of the pocket. Meaning this, when Patrick Mahomes gets outside of the pocket and he scrambles, usually it ends up in a first down. What happened in those critical drives, whether it was the fourth quarter or the overtime victory, he was actually able to go ahead and get a critical first down. And even when you look at the last pass that he had to McCole Hartman, he actually is starting to run towards the line of scrimmage, which actually held one of the corners, and that actually opened up Hardman, for the game-winning touchdown here. So sorry, I'm butchering the names, but you get what I mean. With Travis Kelce, he came on late. He only had 3 yards, I think, at halftime, but he turned it on within the fourth and the overtime. Had 9 receptions, 93 yards. 10 was his 10 targets, and 22 was his longest. So, I just think that the bottom line was this: Travis Kelce knew he had to be that guy. He turned into that guy for the second half. And I think essentially that is what really cost San Francisco. And so you could say that Kansas City essentially won in that aspect of the matchup as well. Lastly, we had the X factors coming up here. And so with the X factors, I talked about these guys being huge. So let's start off with Isaiah Pacheco. So Isaiah Pacheco actually lost a fumble, which actually cost the Chiefs early on in the game. But the fact of the matter is, Isaiah Pacheco was able to find running room throughout the contest. He was 18, had 18 rushes for 59 yards. And even though he didn't score a touchdown, he was able to essentially keep the Kansas City Chiefs on schedule with their downs. I know that the 49ers played a lot of defense where they had actually been able to push Kansas City back and push them off schedule. But there were times, especially critical in the game, where Isaiah Pacheco came up huge. And not only did he come up huge on the ground, I think he was huge as a receiver. He had 6 receptions for 33 yards. That was huge there. And then next, let's look at Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon, although he only had 2 catches for 15 yards, 8 was his longest, he had really critical catches when they needed catches the most in those drives. When you look at that fourth quarter and then overtime, Jerick McKinnon made his 2 catches, and he was 2 of 2, and 8 was his longest. So I think because Jerick McKinnon was in there, he actually added another dimension to the Kansas City Chiefs offense, which I think ultimately kind of helped them out, especially when the 49ers lost one of their key linebackers in Greenlaw. Lastly, Brian Ayuk. I think Brian Ayuk played extremely well for the most part, but I think that because the Chiefs defense was up to the task, they were actually able to hold Brandon Ayuk to only 3 receptions for 49 yards. He did have a big 20-yard gain in this one, but for the most part, as good as Brandon Ayuk has or was this season, he had over 1,000 yards. He had shown that he was more than just a deep threat and that he could run a lot of intermediate routes as well. The fact that the Kansas City Chiefs were able to take him out of the game and actually essentially make Christian McCaffrey the leading receiver with the 8 receptions for 80 yards and a touchdown there was huge for them. So, the X factors pretty much showed up for the most part. I think Brian Ayuk was the guy that was probably minimized the most here. And I think that is another reason why you saw the Kansas City Chiefs win this football game. So lastly, I'll just say this. On all the points, I pretty much had predicted that I thought that the Kansas City Chiefs would win as far as holding Christian McCaffrey. I thought that also, too, Brock Purdy wasn't going to be able to make enough plays with his arms. So I pretty much went ahead and predicted that. And then lastly, I just felt like when it came down to it, the X factors really kind of came in for Kansas City. And I think ultimately the one X factor that I probably should have put up there was Patrick Mahomes. And I don't think that the 49ers necessarily went out and lost the game. I think that it's fair to say that Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs won the game, especially being down 10 here. So with that being said, guys, this is Real Talk Sports with Rico. Make sure you press like and subscribe and follow the show. I will see you guys on the next one. Looking forward to talking some more football and some NBA action coming up as we have All-Star Weekend coming up. All right, guys. Rico, Real Talk Sports, we're out.